Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and joining us this afternoon. I'm so glad to see all of you. It's so glad to be three-dimensional, isn't it, after this time apart. My name is Ethna Lay, and I'm the chair and an associate professor of writing studies and rhetoric. And today it's my pleasure to introduce to you Justin Hodgson, the associate professor of digital rhetoric in the Department of English at Indiana University Bloomington. Justin is the founding editor of the Journal of Undergraduate Multimedia Projects, the Jump Plus Net, and I can tell you, as one of his editors for the student productions, this is worthwhile taking a look at or contributing to if you are working in new media. He's also the director of IU's online first-year composition program. He's a co-leader of IU's Digital Gardner Faculty Fellows Initiative and a 2-year fellow in IU's Institute for Digital Arts and Humanities. Furthermore, he serves as an Adobe digital literacy thought leader. For more than 15 years, Justin's teaching and research has explored the intersections of rhetorical studies and emerging technologies, multimedia composition, and digital creativity, play and game theory, and digital learning and digital pedagogy. He has published scholarship in both print and digital form, championing both critical and creative engagements, publishing in journals such as Kairos, Enculturation, Composition Studies, EDUCAUSE Quarterly, and Textshop Experiments. I think some of you might have seen the link to that video I circulated. His most recent book in 2019 is titled Postdigital Rhetoric and the New Aesthetic, and it is published as an open access monograph with Ohio State. I'd like to set up his talk today, titled Postdigital Writing and Futures, by having us consider the role of maker in terms of our cultural heritage, trafficking as we do in the English language, and then by reflecting on the original and multivalent roles of makers for English speakers. You may recall that the Anglo-Saxon Schope, the poet, is a shaper of words, a maker, a remaker of meaning. These Schopes, these shapers, performed their oral productions at the end of a day in communal, companionable settings. And these makers made language work in variable, recombinant sequences, managing them, changing them, making and remaking them for each instance performed. Schopes effectively remixed the components of their productions, depending upon the particular occasion, the particular audience, and the particular constraints of their performances. And this happened 1,000 years ago. Schopes were makers. Schopes were remakers, using and appropriating language as needed for each rhetorical situation. Anglo-Saxon poetry, also called the supernatural creator, the divinity, was assigned the same title, a holy shaper, a creator, a maker, the one who makes all that is earthly and all that is divine. So these makers, whether poet or divine, were tied to a lived experience, a reality based in earth and clay, of wind and weather, of food and water, of heat and cold, of living and dying. The idea of making is a privileged one. Makers are artists, makers divine. English speakers have always celebrated and approved of those who make, those who remake and shape our lived experience. Thus, English makers represent the kind of willingness to play that Justin Hodgson discusses in Chapter 5 of his recent book. Hodgson explains, technologies accommodate and respond to human habits, methods, procedures, schemas, and so on for being in the world. He explains that humans and computers are combining agencies, creating, making, new artifacts, and dissolving the lines between human and machine, analog and digital. Pre-digital English speakers and writers have a long tradition of engaging in play and in making. So let's make something new now. Join me in welcoming Dr. Justin Hodgson as he shapes for us this cultural moment of digital creativity.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that introduction, Ethna. That was way more than I expected. I've never had my own work quoted back to me, so that was really kind of fun. Also, I feel like I'm at a wedding and I'm on the wrong side because, this is obviously the bride's side and look how crowded they are, right? But I just want to say thank you all for coming today. I know it's a busy time of year and schedules being what they are. So I only hope that I can deliver something that is at least somewhat engaging to you. And if you had a chance to see the video that she sent out, and if your answer or response wasn't what the, then you didn't watch it properly, right? So if you got a chance to check it out, I'll talk a little bit more as we go. But I just want to say thank you again at the Culture Center for having me and being in person and having an opportunity to share some of this stuff with you all. Okay, so I think it's important to start a little bit with identifying where I'm at and where my work is at, so you know kind of where we're coming from. And this talk emerges, at least in part, out of my efforts to extend some concepts from earlier work, which again includes both digital media productions that embrace post-digital sensibilities, and comes from my book on post-digital rhetoric, where I attempt to discern and present a set of heuretics for the doing of rhetoric in a post-digital age. And I'm going to unpack these a little bit, right? But those four kind of key components are things are rooted in what we call attentiveness to aversion, the digital averting to the real, pixelism as an aesthetic value, human technology making, which is probably the center of what I do, and then hypermediation, or a hyper-awareness of the role of media in our lives, or medial components. But for good or bad, the space I occupy as a professional these days is more increasingly between academia and industry, with my work with Adobe and other partners at IU. And so I've become more and more interested in trying to outline the practical value, the why, of the importance of doing digital writing today in higher education, particularly in students' perspectives as they move from that college to career readiness sort of transition. And so as much of my other work is artistic and sort of oddly expressive, I've become much, much more practical in trying to think, here's why this matters, right? And so this talk is kind of going to try and stretch across both frames. So to that end, let me begin again, because I like beginnings. I'm a rhetorical invention guy, so we start anew every time we can. And offer you this kind of orienting claim. If you take nothing else today, this is the sort of the center of what I do, which is to say that mediating technologies, whether they are emergent or established, influence the very means, modes, and metaphors by which one does rhetoric in the everyday. That is, in the how of making rhetorical artifacts. And this relationship between mediating technologies and rhetoric has impact beyond just the making of mediated presentations, as new technologies and their related aesthetics introduce new models and conceptual structures for us to think about and account for things in our world. And this is actually, comes from the book. So, if you're looking for a quote, it's in there. And it's free, so feel free to download it and do nothing with it, or whatever people do with books these days, right? And so, we can see this kind of implication when individuals conceptualize the brain as a computer. The brain is not a computer, it doesn't work that same way. Thinking occurs in distributed ways throughout our entire bodies in fun ways. Or when people, particularly students, typically in my class, see this image as having pixels. This is a photomosaic art, Salvador's, Dali's, Lincoln, and lithograph. And if you're up close, you can see the naked lady or the nude. If you're back of the room, it probably looks like Abraham Lincoln. But it's photomosaic art and not pixel art. But we tend to see these kinds of square representations in pixelated ways because of our relationships with technology. Or most recently, my favorite, I was watching NBC's The Voice with my kids the other night, and Ariana Grande accused Blake Shelton of copying and pasting Kelly Clarkson's verbal argument. And it's the first time copying somebody is one thing, but copying and pasting was a specific language she used when he repurposed Kelly's argument earlier. So, these things seep into us in ways that we are often unaware of, and that shapes a lot of what we think. So, for me, I think we must recognize that at a very basic level, computational, screen-based network media have so saturated our everyday existence that they have not only fundamentally altered, augmented, and expanded the materialities and modalities, the figures and forms that are available to our everyday rhetorical practices, but they have also put digital ways of knowing, doing, and making at the center of everyday life, higher education included. Right? And this centering of digital ways of knowing, doing, and making is really what it means to be in and of the post-digital, but it's also what calls attention to what's at stake in what I call our post-digital futures, and I'm going to unpack these a little bit as we go. Because as technologies become more ubiquitous, or more seamless, or more integrated into our lives, our relationships with them actually change. And what matters for us in a very fundamental way, especially those of us who are educators, is that we need to, when we take stock of these digitally inflected changes, we need to understand that, one, digital saturation is altering both the abilities and the expectations of media that students bring with them to our classes. But also in a wonderful kind of counterintuitive dynamic, the underlying shifts in this relationship are also the very reason why students seem to typically lack digital competencies, and especially the ones that are needed to thrive in today's sort of digital workforce or post-digital working space, whether you're in industry or nonprofit or in education. And it's a lack, mind you, or a gap that is even more pronounced across race and gender and class considerations that are normally associated with the digital divide, the advantage versus disadvantage when it comes to these kind of things. And so, this is sort of the part of the why what I'm doing today. And it's sort of this condition preparing students for an established or ever-emerging digital workforce or digital citizenry, if you hold to the truth that we're not only about preparing students for the working world, and it's this area that I want to turn our attention, because it sets up, again, so much of this why behind the what and the how of my work and my pedagogy, my scholarship, and all the fun things that I try and do at IU and beyond. And so to help up this why, I want to anchor us in two numbers, 47 and 85, and I feel like there should be a Sesame Street ad night. Like today is brought to you by the numbers 47 and 85. And the letters P and D for Postdigital, right? So, but I didn't have time to make that video. I'll be honest, I was busy. And so let me sort of shift here. Did it not go? Okay, let me start with 47. So in 2013, machine learning and future work scholars Michael Osborne and Carl Benedict Frey published their now widely influential labor assessment findings and told us then that nearly 47% of all jobs in the United States were at risk of automation. And that's a fairly large number, and it can be a fairly alarming number. But of course, it isn't really a new idea. The Bureau of Labor Statistics drew similar conclusions as far back as 1960, suggesting that workers who, with routinized labor practices, were susceptible to being replaced by a machine. Maybe some instructors too, I don't know. But where Osborne and Frey differed, notably, was that they based their findings not simply on routine tasks, but on observations of what computers can do or can be made to do, right? And this shift is significant because what computers can do or be made to do is an ever-changing mark, right? One that's evolving not only with each advancement in computationality, each improvement in sensors and circuitry, each upgrade to our network technologies, but also, most importantly, with each change in the human condition, specifically in the way that we relate to these technologies. And so we are now, 8 some odd years removed from Osborne and Frey's work, and perhaps light years from the Bureau of Labor Statistics days when they were calculating tabulations and punch cards. But what we do know is that improvements in hardware, software, artificial intelligence, and things of that nature have facilitated and will continue to facilitate an increase in contemporary workforce that is built not on routinized tasks, but rather on what computers can be made to do, and specifically be made to do in conjunction with people. Right? And so the contemporary workforce, much like the writing classroom, which is where I spend a lot of my time, right, is increasingly then defined by and susceptible to shifts in human technology collaborations. So again, what we can do with them, what computers can do in concert with us, right? And so of interest to us in higher education then, and again, writing studies in particular for those who, the discipline rooted in technology, human relationships, right, writing as a technology, is not only that we understand how computers work on their own, but rather that we better understand the dynamic ways in which humans and computers interact, collaborate, and even co-produce objects, artifacts, and experiences in the world. And computers here is kind of generic label for algorithmic thinking, data mining processes, hardware and software. But ultimately, it comes down to this sort of interaction that leads to an output that's not possible on our own. Right? But how many of you know if there's Wi-Fi in this room? How do you know? Can you see it? Smell it? No, your device tells you it's there, right? And so this kind of dynamic is actually at the core of a lot of the ways in which we interact with many technologies that we actually can't physically see. Although Louis Hernan, who's a design scholar, found a way to map Wi-Fi signals with a color scheme. And it's actually the image on the cover of my book is one of his photos. But apparently we're all being surrounded by these weird swirling Wi-Fi eggs if you have your phone on you. It's like this, you're embedded in the Wi-Fi signal. But so anyways, this shift from seeing computers as tools that do things on their own to understand them as entities with agency that work in conjunction with humans includes or introduces a corollary shift in our approach to this human technology dynamic. Victor Vitanza made this argument a few years back, well, I guess it's probably 20-some-odd years back, 30 years now, in his Critical Subversions article, where he talked about how in rhetoric and writing specifically, we've long situated ourselves towards a will to mastery, helping students master the language, master the writing, right? And of course, he was resistant to that idea back then. But what matters more and more today in a sort of drag and drop or click and flip and tip, tap, and send kind of culture, right, is less that we have students master a particular tool, but rather that we foster a willingness to play with the tool, right? You may not know how to design an image specifically, but you do enough filter choices in Instagram or TikTok or Snapchat, and you can find the one that makes the most sense, and you can recognize that. And that relationship of playing with the tool to discover what is needed rather than creating that entity on your own is really at the heart of what we're talking about, right? So we want to think about how do we get to this particular juncture and the ways we get there. So, this idea sort of really resonates with the larger framework of how I'm positioning what it means to be post-digital or to be in and of the post-digital in the book and since then. And so I want to go further and say that this condition is actually, for me, the kind of underlying condition of today's generation of what I call post-digital learners, which is really where this work begins, is trying to think about this. What does it mean to be a post-digital learner? Which is, I assume most of you, though, maybe you'll reject me as we go. It's perfectly fine, right? I hope so. But a post-digital learner typically are students at this point who have been so saturated by digital technologies in their entire lives and who have learned to work with them and live with them and play with them and to develop expectations of what an authentically digitally mediated experience is. And this is what it means to be a post-digital learner, to be immersed in this. In fact, one of the biggest complaints during the pandemic was not online learning itself, but the horrible experiences of online learning, right? And part of the reason for that is that many students have an expectations of what a mediated experience looks like on the computer because of their years and years and years of playing with media. And a talking head over PowerPoint is not it, right? And so we've since seen in the last year, as people have developed better and more understanding of how these things work, attentiveness to designing better experiences that are mediated rather than just, a kind of commitment. It's reflective of this sort of dynamic, but perhaps maybe it would help if I take a minute to introduce or define what does it mean to be post-digital, right? And so the post-digital term as itself comes into being, originates from electronic music composer Kim Cascone, who coined this term actually in the year 2000, right as the new media shift was taking off. And it was offered in reference to electronic music practices that were embracing imperfections and techno mishaps and scratches and code errors and sound eruptions, things that fell outside of the pursuit of better fidelity or better efficacy in recording and production technologies. And so it was a kind of counter movement, right, to the techno-determinist perspective that many saw happening in new media in general, but new media art and new media scholarship. And in the past decade or so, the term has actually come to serve as something of an umbrella concept for things like James Bridle's new aestheticism, glitch art, digital aversion, pixelism, and a slew of other artistic and industry practices, whether in architecture or in fashion, that seek to blur the digital-real divide, that bring computationality into art and art into computationality. I don't know if anybody got to see the Rain Room exhibit when it was in the MoMA. I think it's MoMA. Anyways, if you get a chance, I highly encourage you to check it out. It's a room full of rain, but when you walk through, you don't get wet, right? The space becomes three-dimensionally represented, and your body becomes a negation of the rain flows, so it anticipates where you're at. It's a Hollywood invention, but it's a really cool art exhibit. And so these kinds of things are all designed, and what the newest or the post-digital come to represent was the ways in which we call attention to the core dynamics of a human technology assemblage. And so let me see if we can. I'm going to play a little bit of something here, a part of this clip, hopefully. Because for me, I only started thinking about the post-digital in about 2015, and it had already been in sort of circulation for at least 15 years, but predominantly at least 5 years. And I realized at the time that actually some of my own work had been for years playing in and across the kind of shapes or shadows of the post-digital, fragmented, mediated embodiment and layered spectacle. So I'll play a little bit to show you some early on production that I did. Let's see. I'll go back. I can't see if it's playing on my end. Hold on, wait for it. There it goes.
As Blanchard has told us, the human movement is the one that goes right to the limit. And at the end of thought, the limits we seek is only another thought. Another page, another device, another path which we create, another device which we create, another path which we create. For all we have in the spectacle is flow. For all we have in the spectacle is the human movement. De Boer has told us that. Human electric movement, electric movement. Twitching, if not tweeting. Twitching. Gestures that call forth the electric world. gestures that call forth the electric world, bringing the limit of movement to us, bringing the limit of movement to us, rather than us to it. And when we reach the edge, that limit, that end, Blanchot says we simply change to another thought. This is the only way it is possible to go to the end of thought. To get on or invent another path, making our way. It is pathwork. It is ergodic.
I don't know about you, but it's very loud from my end. I like it. It's good. This work of mine, at the time played a lot with the intersections of rhetorical theory and performance, and thinking about what we can make media do. In this case, trying to visualize some of the work of Blanchot and whatnot, and Debord, and think about our role in relation to the spectacle. And of course, this is what, 2009, 2010, that this was in Kairos, and initially published in Kairos. And so, I was already leaning this way anyways. About how do we draw attention to our relationship with technology. And I think if you had to ask me one question that guides much of what I do, it is, what is your relationship with technology? Like, this is a question that guides a lot of my classes. It's kind of the thing that lingers in my own work, because I don't think we spend enough time thinking about technology in this sense. What is my relationship with it? What does it mean to me? What do I do with it, right? So when we think about something like the term post-digital, I don't mean that we are somehow beyond the digital. Rather, I use the post-digital to denote that we are so fully immersed in the digital that to draw distinctions between things like the digital and the real is not only impossible, but it kind of misses the mark. I mean, to just put it plainly, on a daily basis, most of us have more digitally mediated experiences than none. It's part of our everyday sort of value. We navigate our lives through digital means. We dwell in homes immersed in digital signals. We even go to bed with digital devices, and all that implies. The digital is all around us, with us, on us, in us, and of us. Nearly every moment of our lives. And so to separate the digital is to kind of ignore its fundamental condition, which is that it is integrated with the human condition at this particular point in culture. So what the term post-digital is designed to do, at least as I've been situated in it, is to call attention to the fact that we are so saturated by digital mediated experiences that to be is in many ways to be digitally mediated, and subsequently then to relate to the world in digitally mediated ways. And this is key because how we relate to the world, digitally otherwise, specifically, though, introduces fundamental shifts in our sensibilities, or as McLuhan would say, introduces shifts in the very ratios by which we make sense of our worlds. Time and space and place all change once we are integrated with a digital tool like GPS or real-time tracking. I mean, I've had 3 text messages and 2 phone calls since I got up here, right? So clearly, we're always on and always available, right? That kind of thing. But it also invites an assortment of changes of our expectations of everyday life and our expectations of people in education and beyond. And so perhaps, part of what I'm driving at then is, again, this kind of update or counterpart of Prinsky's myth of the digital native. And I say myth of the digital native, we've all used this term, but it's a myth because many of the claims that Prinsky offered about digital natives didn't exactly work out as suggested. To drive the point home, the digital natives that Mark Prinsky wrote about 21 years ago are now faculty and instructors who regularly struggle to make a Zoom breakout room work. And so, I'm not so sure that that's stuck. But what Prinsky's work did, and I love the concepts, and it did it well, was it provided us an opportunity and an operative perspective that remain useful in our conversations and our pedagogical orientations about the distinctions between digital immigrants versus digital natives. It was a set of orientations, not a defining sort of moment. And so, I would like to offer, at least in part, I guess, post-digital learners as a kind of version of this, where these are folks who are, their daily lives, and they see their own daily lives as being networked and mobile and fluid. They know how to operate meaningfully in a culture of digital saturation, but their particular relationship with digital technologies has then also introduced a new condition, which is why we may be dealing with post-digital learners in just about every report, from academic work to experts in industry. That students, typically speaking, across the board, have a lack of basic digital competencies when they come in to work. These folks are technologically savvy, don't get me wrong, but yet somehow not necessarily digitally literate. And I've encountered this a number of times where a student knows how to use Google Docs but can't find the file. It doesn't even know how to find files, right? And it's not a knock on the student. It's a fundamental shift in how they relate to technologies that's different from the way that I related to technologies at the time, and different the way that I'm continuing to relate to the technologies. And so before we go too far down the post-digital path and all the fun things that I learn from students every week, I want to bring us back to our other sort of numerical sponsor today, which is 85%. And this is a little more telling, I think. In 2017, the Institute for the Future projected that nearly 85% of all jobs by the year 2030 would be entirely new creations, right? So we're not talking, the vast majority of college graduates in 2030 who would earn jobs would not be replacement hires for people who are retiring or a departed employee. You know, it's not like Bob from accounting is retiring and Sarah's going to take his job, but we're talking altogether new positions, altogether new professions, and altogether new audiences, creating and contributing to completely new customer experiences and services. This is a projection, right? Of course, 2030 may seem somewhat far off, especially given the ever-growing, slowing sense of time in the pandemic, or the 36,000 days that was the year 2020. But 2018 World Economic Forum projected that in the U.S. alone, we'd see a 30% increase in these kinds of new creations by 2022, which, isn't that far off. And so, what we're looking at then is a gradual progression of new jobs, new positions, and new careers. And B, if you will, that this year's graduates will be increasingly trying to translate their college experiences for markets that do not align with their degree programs necessarily or their disciplinary frameworks, because you can't anticipate a job or career that doesn't exist. And of course, these are just projections. Don't get me wrong. They might be wrong, but it wasn't that long ago that web content producer didn't exist, or learning experience designer, or TikTok strategist didn't exist, even at places like Purina or Coca-Cola, right? So, what's more, and I think this is perhaps the more alarming reality, is that all of those projections occurred before COVID-19. And so the subsequent work from home transformation and the ongoing great resignation suggests that we are looking at perhaps yet again, even more drastic kinds of considerations between where we are, what we're preparing students to do, and how do we prepare them to enter a dramatically shifting workforce, beyond just how do we get them to engage meaningfully in our courses and across disciplines. And so we might need to start asking ourselves some questions like, how will we evolve in higher education to not only better prepare students for an increasingly digital world and digital workforce, if not be just simply to be a digital citizen, but to help prepare digital or post-digital learners to pursue jobs and careers that A, do not yet exist, B, don't align necessarily with their disciplines, and C, increasingly demand more sophisticated levels of digital fluency. So this is sort of the operational space that I'm coming from. And one solution I'd like to offer, and this is sort of perhaps what I do mostly these days, is to suggest that we turn to more overtly integrating digital literacy, digital creativity, and digital learning into our own curriculums. And for one, I think this shift allows us to maybe move away from building better lectures and focus instead on building better learning experiences, right? Ones that are rooted in the play of human technology collaborations, the ability to leverage creative digital media and creative media in critical, if not rhetorical ways, and to engage in learning practices that actively champion the development of digitally inflected soft skills, digital communication, digital creativity, digital collaboration, and critical thinking through digital technologies, or problem solving through digital modes. In fact, the primacy of soft skills, which is again what most of us teach in the humanities at the core, right? Seems to be the one thing that's impervious to nearly all workforce fluctuations. And there's research from Patron at LinkedIn, and I see it's not cited here, but I can share with you, that talks about these skills continue to matter in new and exciting ways, and continuing to show up, especially like digital creativity, in like over 78% of LinkedIn ads in the last 2 years. So let me offer then a little bit of a shift here to kind of get you out of just necessarily listening to me and start watching things that are, well, less crazy than that first video that I showed you. And so a decade ago, I was asked by the folks at Kairos, again, it's a journal in the field of rhetoric and composition called the Journal of Rhetoric, Technology, and Pedagogy, I believe, to do an interview on the importance of having undergraduates work in digital media or to do multimedia writing. But it seemed to me that rather than doing an interview, the better way would be to highlight the value of digital media would be to do it through digital means. And so I put together a project team of grad students, and we kind of reimagined the engagement. We interviewed a bunch of people about digital media work, bringing together multiple voices and perspectives, which added a much needed depth because nobody wants to listen to me all the time, and I appreciate that. And so getting more voices was helpful. And then what we did was we edited those audio responses and then created animations or performances around their ideas. And I'm going to show you sort of two examples from this project.
someone who's interested in text, I might think about multimedia in terms of footage, not just in terms of the artifact, but it's kind of a way to find my footing, to get traction into a text. And the reason multimedia is so cool is because it brings textuality alive. I think of like a Howlin' Wolf recording, and to suddenly see him there, dancing around, and you get a different sense than listening to the recording. Likewise, when you can see all the facial tics and then hear the voice of the author come alive, that's where multimedia is important. So you take a text and you breathe new life into it when it becomes multimedia. You have not just the words printed on a page, but also the context of sight and sound and the rich combination of that matrix.
That's one.
In terms of the theory that underlies multimedia, I think it's kind of rhizomatic. I mean, I think it's a bunch of different ideas developing in different media, and I think you take one media as far as you can go with it, and then maybe you switch to another medium, and then you take that medium as far as you can go with it, and you switch to another medium, and then maybe you mix together two or three media. And I think it's a sort of trial and error process inherent to working with viewing multimedia.
Okay, so what I enjoy about these two projects and these particular representations is not only that they bring ideas to life in particular ways, which I think is really helpful, but they demonstrate a little bit of what is at stake, which is that when we work in a range of media, this necessarily invites us to not only engage in a broader set of capacities, but also invites different kinds of thinking and different kinds of rhetorical orientations, which in turn has the ability to open up new areas of inquiry and new kinds of engagements. And since this point earlier in my work, I've continued to try and drive along this line of what is the value of this work? Why do I do it, and why do I want others to do it? And so what I've come up with over the last decade or so is sort of four core considerations, right, of why we do these things. One, when we provide students the opportunity to learn new media authoring skills and encourage them to engage in digital writing practices, broadly construed, we quite literally expand their capacities for expression. And this helps students to not only tell better stories, whether they're building their own brands or otherwise, right? But more importantly, it helps them take on greater and different degrees of agency, which is needed in a post-digital landscape. Two, when we invite students to work in and across different forms of mediation, we create avenues for them to access ideas in new ways. This is not only meant in terms of what they might make in my course, like a podcast, for example, but fundamentally in the ways in which they might engage a given course's content. And so it shapes and shifts the way we think about that kind of engagement if you just invite them to create a scrolling digital essay or video response instead of a reading response or instead of a written essay. Three, as an extension of number two, working in new media can also help students find a voice or have meaningful success in ways that are outside of the traditional or expected modes of academic discourse. And this is especially important for first-generation, non-traditional, and international students, for many of whom traditional academic discourse can be a major hurdle, if not an insurmountable barrier. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. And four, as Sarah Arroyo argued so brilliantly in her work on participatory culture, when we create digital things, and students are included in this too, when they create digital things, there's an active desire to share the work, sharing their creations with family and friends or on TikTok or Instagram or whatever we're doing these days, or even as part of their professional portfolios. I can count on one hand the number of times a student has told me over in the last 15 years they've had a parent or a friend read an essay from my class on their own volition. But I can't tell you, I can't count the number of students who've told me that this week from the poster projects they made in my class, right? And so there's just a fundamentally different orientation to the way we treat digital media. That's not to say writing is lagging or bad or anything, but it's just the orientation is different. And so there's a kind of public-facing dimension that seems to be built in our real-world audience that others might actually see your work. Nobody ever accidentally reads your essay. Somebody might accidentally see your video, right? And if it looks like crap, then you're going to take that personally. So there's a responsibility in that sort of more public-facing audience that's built into this kind of approach. And so these things are significant on their own, but I want to sort of shift a little bit, not shift, but to illustrate some of the power of these kinds of implications and share with you a couple of student examples, right? I think because the more I can put students' work in front of you instead of my own, the better we all are, because I think they make brilliant, wonderful things, and they are a testament to what it means to think in different and wonderfully engaging ways. And so I want to tell you two stories, one about Tanya and one about Tianqi, and they occurred nearly 10 years apart in my academic livelihood, but they offer really incredible resonances. So Tanya was the first generation Hispanic student at the University of Texas who enrolled in my advanced digital rhetoric course in her senior year, and she was, by her own account, a horrible writer. She told me so after the first class. She said, Professor Hodgson, I'm a horrible writer. I just need a C so I can graduate. What do I need to do to get a C? And I, learning from many wonderful mentors over the years, I told her what they would have told me, which is, you're not a horrible writer. You just haven't had any positive writing experiences yet. So let's focus on that, and then we'll see where we are at the end of the semester. And in her defense, she struggled with some of the early stuff that was, traditionally writing oriented. But as we shifted into digital writing practices and began working with Photoshop and other tools, Tanya found a point of access, right? More importantly, for the first time in her life in a writing classroom, the playing field had been leveled, right? She's bilingual, the only person in her family that spoke English and Spanish. Her parents spoke only Spanish. And so she had been dealing with language in interesting ways. But now here in the classroom, everybody was just as confused about what the hell to do with Photoshop, right? So there was a wonderful positive thing going on there. And she quickly became a leader in the classroom conversation as she committed herself to this work. And so when I introduced this interactive image project, which I hope is playing, or hopefully here, there's no sound, so it's fine. This project pairs Photoshop skills, image design, with Wix.com. So if you're familiar with Wix, and it's designed to leverage the power of visual metaphors to create an interactive kind of digital storytelling process. But at its core, this is a 15-page research paper. And that's really what they're doing. It's an in-depth research project. And Tanya focused on texting while driving. She'd had a friend who died in a texting while driving accident, so it was very personal and very important to her. And so in addition to doing traditional research that includes writing, she designed the experience as a phone. And you click around the buttons on the phone to get to the content, including videos of crashes, and seeing varying kinds of representation to start thinking about the problem in a different way and the way you would represent it in a different way. And so this is this sort of opportunity for her to find a kind of voice was really exciting and to see it happen. In fact, her first job after UT Austin was she got a job as a web content producer for a student who couldn't write, right? And so she's since gone on to do other things, but it's a testament to the value of when we remove some of the barriers and we put some opportunities in front of people, the way they approach the content and the way they approach the engagement is can be genuinely surprising. And so fast forward 10 years later, I'm now at IU teaching a summer class on advanced expository writing, whatever that actually means. So I have students do this project where they're essentially writing an informative essay about their hometown. It's one of the series that we do. And Tianqi is an international student from China. And who carried a lot of the traditional things you would see in second language learners, usage issues, pronoun issues in her writing. But once we started working in the media, it sort of took off in a really interesting way. What I'm going to show you here, if I can get the clip to work, is this about 2 minutes of the project in which she storyboarded out the essay, what she wanted to say in this essay, then recorded her friend who's a sand artist making the visuals in real time, and then brought that together with a voiceover and video effects, all in Adobe Premiere Pro. And for good measure, just so you know, both Tanya and Tianqi's first introduction to these somewhat relatively difficult tools to get well at, I should say, was in my class. So they had no experience at all using anything in Adobe before coming to this class, which is part of my pedagogy. I give you the 8 crayons of Photoshop, and I expect you to paint Picasso. And it seems weird, but it works. It really does. So let me see if I can get this to work. I'm going to have to leave gotta leave the presentation. Hold on. It's over here. Don't mind me. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Let me see if I can.
Haven't been arrested.
Wrong way. You're supposed to play as I drag you over there. Oh. All right, let me know when you can see it.
Of Changchun City since childhood, I can confidently say that it is one of the most important hubs of economic, political, and most importantly, cultural activity in my country. This city is quite huge in line with its status as the capital of Jilin province. Indeed, this community is known for several things, but none of this is equal to the wondrous winter season and its cultural accompaniments. This season has continually shaped my cultural identity as it highlights important cultural aspects that define us as the Changchun community. The winter season in my hometown is exceptional to say the least. My community engaged in numerous social and leisure activities to usher in this spectacular season. One of the most conspicuous among these is the widespread purchase of large quantities of Chinese cabbage. Large quantities of this vegetable are first arranged outside in the open sun to dry in preparation for use in making Chinese sauerkraut, a major ingredient in our community cuisines. In the old past, large quantities of cabbage are bought to ensure there is enough vegetable in store to last the entire winter. Essentially, the community is usually hit by a severe shortage of vegetable in this season, which means that people have to find a way to store this precious but perishable vegetable. Consequently, this activity has become an important component of our community's tradition. For me, the sight of large quantities of cabbage around my community is something that triggers a feeling of excitement, because it marks the onset of my most favorite season among the whole year, a period characterized by various delicious cuisines, festivals, vacations, and above all, family reunion. In my hometown, temperatures vary significantly all through the year, which defines the 4 seasons clearly. Winter is usually the longest, sometimes lasting for up to 7 months. Day length usually gets shorter as we move into midwinter. As the temperature is -10 Fahrenheit, I dress for the occasion, and so does other teenagers in our community. Our usual dress code comprises of down coat, woolen hat, scarf, muffle, and mask specifically made for the freezing weather.
Yeah, we'll stop it there. I know, it's really good. Sorry. I would let you watch the whole 8-minute video, right? It's beautiful, and she continues to tell this wonderful story about her hometown and the connections to it. But again, what I find most impactful is that in both these students represent this ability to, when we give them an opportunity to expand their capacities for expression, right? We also give them an opportunity to find their voice or to find success in meaningful ways. But this actually happens with students of all varieties. It's not just those who are typically on the disadvantaged side of the digital divide, right? Because different media authoring skills simply help students to tell better stories, to produce better content, and create better engagements, in which their skills they're going to need wherever they go, both while they're here, but also after they are done. And in fact, a study that just came out last week from Adobe and Civitas, in conjunction with University of Texas at San Antonio and Cal State University Fullerton and East Tennessee State University, suggests that digital creativity and digital literacy skills improve student outcomes and learning and their retention and engagement in classrooms. And this is especially true for students who fall on the disadvantaged side of the digital divide. As at UT San Antonio, they found that the use of digital creative technologies in classrooms resulted in over 2.5 times, 2 times higher course grades among Black and African American students, and nearly 2.5 times higher for first-time in college students. But beyond, again, those are early indications for these underrepresented populations in higher education. The impact on these students, what they may be able to do after graduation, is also significant, because LinkedIn data that's a part of this study shows that over the last 2 years, the demand for creative skills or digital creative skills and jobs listed on LinkedIn has grown 78%. So it's not saying that it's just, this improved 78% from what digital creativity was already listed as on that site. And so, as we start to think about these kinds of things, there's just evidence that suggests that in digital creative dynamics improve student engagement, student retention, student involvement in class, and can have a positive impact on what you're doing and on your course. And I've sort of even taken this further lately and started designing more and more assignments that are not only built around digital writing practices, broadly construed, but designed to empower students to take up topics that will let them make a difference in the world, right? And so, let me see if I can, is this one going to roll? Okay. So this is a quick video. Is it playing again? Okay. This is from Carolyn Kilfie, a student in my class a couple semesters back. She created this Adobe Spark page, which is a scrolling digital essay platform. Very easy to use. It's a plus button system. If you're around for one of the workshops tomorrow, I'll show you how to do this in like 3 minutes. It's really simple and really easy to a fun tool. But what she's doing is she's blending together text and visuals and information and infographics and video but also research-based exposition and personal narrative. I mean, she tells her own story at the end, right? This story about not only how do we deal with mental health in college campuses, how do we unstigmatize this, but then talks about what is it like to live with anxiety and be a student, and interviews other students who are willing to share this. It's just a rich, wonderful kind of experience, and to read through as somebody who reads essays all the time, I promise you this is a refreshing change of pace. And so it's projects like Carolyn's and others that led me to create The Jump, which I'm not going to speak about a lot, but if you go to jumpplus.net, you can see a ton of student projects, some of which work, some of which don't. We're an undergraduate journal. We do open platforms, so we can't always control and archive everything. But each piece that's published comes with its own little ecology. You have a student piece, you have a student reflection on the creation, you have an instructor reflection on the creation, you have a course assignment and description, you've got 2 reviewers who create responses, and they're not critiques. They take up a project as if it's a relay and think, what does this project make me want to make or say or do? And so the latest issue just dropped last week, so you can check that out. And so I want to shift here because I know we're pushing the edge of time. I don't want to take up more than I need to, but I want to show you one last example, and maybe the most profound example I've had so far to date, which is a project from Andrew Williams, who's an African-American student who was majoring in informatics at IU at the time. And it's a digital remix project from this class that I teach. And the guiding course of the class is, what is our relationship with technology? So I'm going to just see if I can make this go. Okay, so I think it's important to recognize that the original video was created by Kat Napiorkowski. And so in its entirety, it's a pretty powerful message on depression, right? But what Andrew did was take this video and add all the, using Photoshop and Audition and Premiere and all these sort of tools, and add the tweets and the Shutterstock imagery and the sound effects and change the music, and to create this transformation that suggests this is a statement about the ways we sort of falsely represent ourselves online versus the lived reality of everyday experience. And again, to be fair, there's something powerful in the original message, but there's also something I think equally powerful in this remix in the way that it gives voice to a kind of state. In this case, it was a class on what is our relationship with technology, and thinking about that and how it worked. And of course, that was before the pandemic, so I assume it would be a different video at this point if Andrew were to make it. But these projects, every semester they make me want to not only learn more and do more and work with students on these cool stuff and fun stuff, but to increasingly advocate for others to do these kinds of things in their class, because of the kind of impact they can have, not only on us in terms of learning and engagement and outcomes, but on the kind of things students can take with them and share with others, and really sort of think about their role in the world as being active digital producers. Again, to be is to be digitally mediated, but that also means to have an existence in the digital world, you have to create something. You are more than a data point. You have to make something to be a participant. And so this is sort of at the root of what I do. And when we provide students with digital creative opportunities, we provide them new ways, new means, and new avenues through which to envision and quite literally transform their worlds. And so if we want to prepare our students to be successful, to be competitive on the job market, to be enabled as citizens to thrive within and beyond our disciplinary boundaries, we have to not only give them access to digital creative opportunities, but we have to prepare them to leverage greater degrees of agency across these emerging mediascapes and enable them to be thought leaders for a digital future to come. And this has critical implications for higher ed and writing studies and things like that. But it's more significant, I think, for our students in the ability to develop greater degrees of greater degrees of agency to be able to live and thrive in our current landscape of a digitally enabled world, and prepare for this wonderful post-digital labor market, whatever it's going to look like in 2030. I hope to still have a job by then, so we'll see. Let me then conclude just this last question, and this is something I ask pretty much everyone that I talk with, which is, given the things we know about the transformations and where we are today and where we are tomorrow, really comes down to how will you prepare yourself as students, or how will you prepare your students as faculty for the challenges of this kind of post-digital tomorrow. So what kind of commitments are you interested in making that are easy, that are subtle, but that have grand impact? And I think a very simple change is just giving people the opportunity to work in creative ways, in digitally creative ways, creates the space that's enough to put the power back in the hands of the students. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And now we have time for questions or concerns or comments. Or if you just want a selfie with me, I will pose. I'm joking. It's okay. It's a digital thing, right? We're supposed to document these things as we go. No questions. Perfect. It's going to be a quick evening. Yeah, you have to speak in the mic. Otherwise, the people online won't hear you. But if you want, I can just repeat it. That would be helpful.
Thank you for this. It was very interesting. I was wondering if in your understanding digital literacies versus, I guess we'll call them traditional literacies, have you noticed any nuances lost or in translation that you've had to work hard to incorporate, or do you feel that they were unnecessary for expression?
That's a good question. So let me back up. I think, one of the tensions we run into with the term like digital literacies is that it covers such a wide gamut. Includes everything from creating pivot tables in Excel to making a video. And so it's hard to, to narrow it down. But I think, by far, things like, writing as a practice is a tool that works for very specific ways. Long form engagement, I think you can do things in poetry, in writing, that you can't do in other modes. But at the same time, it lacks opportunities that some of the other media that have. But I think perhaps, to me, maybe the most profound way I think about this is, rather than seeing sort of what gets lost, I think about what opens up and an opportunity for me to help others understand the rhetoric that's involved. And so I actually started this whole journey of mine as an adjunct at a community college teaching basic and developmental writing, which are students who have trouble writing paragraphs, who are taking classes they're paying for but don't get credit for because they don't count as a freshman comp credit. And they were struggling with some of the very basic things. And the textbook was wonderfully done by the faculty, but it just wasn't hitting students where they are, right? There was a gap. And it's not a knock on the faculty or the students, it's just a breakdown. So we were talking about transitions in writing, right? The sort of nuance of how you build a bridge between ideas. And the best way I knew how to do that was through video transitions. And so I had these, 8 to 10, high school students who barely graduated high school at the time, tell their stories, and they had to make a 30-second little image-based video. So they had to go on Google, find like 10 images, and tell a one-paragraph story and record themselves saying it, right? Because they could speak what they had in mind, they just had trouble putting the words on the page. And but they had to use transitions between the images. So I don't know if you remember Windows Movie Maker. I don't know if that still exists, but it had all these like just weird stock things. So like, you had the page turn transition or the hard out one, which I really enjoyed, right? And so they would just choose these things at first randomly and then intentionally. And we were able to have perhaps the most sophisticated conversation I've ever had in a classroom about the rhetoric of transitions because they were able to visually see it. And then later we were able to move back into the writing and leverage those as a set of metaphors for talking about what they're trying to do in their writing. And luckily, they all skipped developmental writing altogether and went right into freshman comp. And I don't think it was because of me. I think it's because of them and their ability to access stuff. But for me, it's not. I think there are things that are lost. Don't get me wrong. Absolutely, there are things that get lost as you move across different any mode, right, of communication. But I think if we see the affordances of the new thing as an opportunity to make connections or to build bridges, or to maybe breathe life back into something else that already existed, then it creates this rich opportunity for people to discover all kinds of amazing things. So that would be. I mean, we'd have to really get into the weeds about. Let's talk about digital literacy as rhetorical representation and break it down further. But okay, so just yeah. This is just for those online. The question was about critical depth, right, and the role of its potential in these other modalities, right? So do I think so? I do. I honestly do think that we can achieve critical depth. I don't think depth is necessarily a response of the technology. I don't think people invented writing and thought, ooh, depth, right? Because this isn't how it works. But the way we get conditioned to understand and experience those media, that may be one of the driving problems here, especially if you think about post-digital learners as I was defining them, right? If you're always saturated by media streams that are short and quick and sort of, I always call them ADHD compliant, right? As somebody who gets distracted wonderfully effectively in all kinds of ways, that there's a draw to think of things as being fast, as being efficient, as being impactful media, right? So the choice it seems to be not is it a fault of the tool or the technology, but is it a fault of the way we approach it? And I think, to give an example, when I was finishing my PhD, I did a dissertation in print because that's what was required, but I also did a version in digital format. I created two, right? One that was like this 3-chapter long interactive web weird text in the Sophie platform, which no longer exists, at least not that version, so you can't even play it anywhere now. It's like this archaic dinosaur. But the whole point of that was to say that you can do critical scholarship working across interactive media. And it's not simply because the text affords it, it's because of what the media are doing together and how you then present that. In fact, the better part of I think, the media version that I created at the time was that in addition to the regular kind of experiential approaches to thinking about digital tools and technology and scholarship, I'm also able to embed ongoing reflection narratives about what I'm doing. So I can't put a reflection narrative on the margins of a textbook. Well, at least I can now with hypothesis and other things. But at the time, thinking about what is this role of ideation? How does it develop? What are the nuances in the argument? What if I can illustrate that in a way in a video that would take me 5 pages to do meaningfully in a text because of the nuance, right? Because we can see things, we can get things from atmosphere or mood. That is, I think we have to physically, intentionally, explicitly put into a text, right? So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think if there is a limit to how we think about critical depth, and especially in fun flash media, right, it's our orientation to it. Right? Todd May was on my dissertation committee. He's a philosophy professor at Clemson, and he consulted on The Good Place. I don't know, he was in like the last episode, so he's a fun guy. But Todd gave me the best advice ever about writing, which is there's no substitution for clarity of thought, right? And the better you understand your ideas, the more clearly they'll come through. So there's no amount of flash, whiz, bang that I can do if I don't understand the ideas and where they're going. And that has nothing to do with the technology in itself. It has to do with the way I'm oriented my thinking in relationship to the tools. So I think it's a legitimate concern, especially when you start bringing them in, because it's also a layer of how do I disabuse students of a particular orientation. But I think you'd be surprised. Not a lot of students even see the problem. Like if you create the scaffolding, like the critical depth we need is these sort of things, or these kind of benchmarks. I think you'd be surprised at actually what comes back, right? I mean, these are all meant to be performative engagements that I've demonstrated, minus the mental health one, which is a more traditional writing thing. But so they're all along the same lines, but it's really, I think, an orientation from what does culture tell me I'm supposed to do with this video? Or, how many characters am I limited now on Twitter? 280, something like that. So I can't say anything in 280 characters. It's ridiculous. You don't have to ask questions. It's not a requirement of your attendance. I know that, right? Especially for the students, right? Although, yeah, she said bonus points, right? No, I'm joking. It's good.